You're about to listen to an episode of the Leadership Melting Pot podcast, brought to you by Lumerous. Engage with us as we dissect an aspect of leadership and see how you may apply some of what is shared across your business. Welcome, Professor. It's been a while. Good to see you, and thanks so much for taking time out to be on the podcast with us. What are you up to these days? Are you still at now Bayes Business School?
Bayes. The name has changed, but the school is still the same where you were.
I almost said Cass Business School.
Yeah, you can still say Cass because we still write formally Cass, just so that there is no confusion. It's still the same school.
Right. Before we jump in the conversation, what are some of the exciting research that you're working on these days? I know you're always doing some exciting stuff.
Lots. One is about transparency in supply chains, what companies disclose and why they disclose some things and not others. So that's statistical or empirical work. I do want to write about modern slavery from a risk perspective. I have some sort of a sketch, but that's that. There's a few other projects going on at different stages.
I know you're always doing a lot of research and publishing. And I know that my whole introduction to sustainable supply chain was based on you and your lecture, and I took a really deep interest in that years ago. Even when I was working at Accenture, one of the areas I specialized in back in those days was supply chain sustainability. So you were one of the perfect persons for us to have this conversation with today, as it relates to, child slavery and forced labor and human trafficking in the supply chain. But before we jump in the conversation though, Prof, how would you define the whole notion of, child labor, forced labor, and human trafficking? Are they one of the same, or are they separate?
Child labor can be legal or illegal. Trafficking is always illegal, and trafficking includes a lot more things than child labor, including sex trafficking. So they're not the same, but certainly they overlap quite a bit.
You said something interesting, which is the first I've ever heard, is that child labor can either be legal or illegal. I always thought it was illegal to have child laborers.
Well, it depends. I mean, in many countries, you do help out your parents. If it's a small field for a family, then the kids will go out and help time to time. And I'm sure your parents made you wash dishes at some point.
Yes. I'm not going to let my kids listen to this, because next thing they're going to tell me I'm having, to do child labor.
So we have to be very careful with these words. Partly because our kids don't rebel against us and say, oh, that's child labor.
Okay. I never thought about that. And I'm pretty sure
I think where child labor goes bad is if you're taking away the children's future away from them.
Right.
By not providing education, by not providing even enough nutrition, or exposing the children to hazardous chemicals, for example, in Congo, with the mining of
the
cobalt. That's where you start getting into child labor being extremely undesirable for the children. And that's what we would like not to happen.
Right. And I think when people think about child labor, that's where the thought goes first. It goes to places like those. So you have child labor, and you also have forced labor. And a lot of people don't recognize that forced labor can be separate from child labor and can also be separate from human trafficking as well, right? Forced labor is, as it says, pretty much kind of forcing someone to work, against their will.
People still this is 2023, and people are still being sold into slavery to work on fields or whatever. It can be done in very sophisticated ways, bringing people over to England and then make them work in fields for £1 a day or something. This is 2023. and this is still happening. So forced labor can take many forms, other than and not just in distant countries, but onshore too. So and trafficking means moving the people around for that forced labor or for forced sex and other things. So trafficking is yet another dimension.
Human trafficking is not just about, because, when I speak to people about human trafficking, the first thing that comes to mind, they would refer to things like, prostitution, like, kidnapping young girls and putting them into the sex trade and all of that. But human trafficking in the supply chain is much deeper than that, correct?
It's much deeper, much wider problem, because it's not just young women being sold into sexual slavery, but also bringing people over to England to work on fields, putting 15 people in a room, and then effectively paying them nothing, a pound a day. And these are people coming in from other European countries, and not just a typical third world poor country kind of problem. It's a much wider problem than we normally recognize.
Right. Would you say, for example, if someone is employed and is paying, say, for example, here in the UK, way below the minimum wage, like, just peanuts, would that fall into forced labor or human trafficking in one of those?
It would, because it would fall into forced labor, because if the labor wasn't forced, they would just walk away and get a job paying minimum somewhere else, minimum wages somewhere else. So the fact that they can't do it is because they're forced. Somebody's keeping their passport, somebody's telling them, we'll kill your family if you don't do this, and so on.
So what are some of the, why do you think, we're having this kind of issue with human trafficking and forced labor and child labor in the supply chain in 2023? I mean, is it just because of it's cheap labor and it makes the cost of products way less expensive? Or is there something deeper than that?
You nailed the problem on the head. There is a supply and there is a demand. There's a supply of poor people everywhere around the world, including in England. And there is a demand for cheaper goods, cheaper sex, whatever, everywhere in the world. And so if you connect the two somehow, there you'll have trafficking, you'll have forced labor, you'll have forced child labor. All kinds of things happen, but there has to be a supply and demand, and that's definitely, we all want cheap goods. We'll go to stores and buy cheaper food, cheaper vegetables, cheaper clothing, and similarly, somebody somewhere in the world is willing to provide or is being forced to provide that. And that's why we have it.
It's one of the reasons why things like chocolate and coffee, I only buy fair trade, because, for example, there was this big case in Ghana where they were forcing young children to work in the cocoa fields, and some of them were actually kidnapped from, villages and taken to the estates in terms of doing that. So, we have to be important. We have to be conscious about that. And I'll discuss that a little bit more with you. But, what are some of the challenges involved in preventing the use of child labor and human trafficking in the supply chain?
Okay, let me give an indirect answer first with an analogy. If you think about the drug trade, cocaine, supposedly illegal drugs, there is a supply and a demand. I mean, there's no question there are people willing to grow or cultivate or produce those drugs, fentanyl, whatever it is, and then there are people willing to consume it. So you would think that after all the legal efforts made by all countries, not just Western countries, all countries against illegal drugs, we should have it. It should be over by now, right?
Yeah.
Yet the drug trade has only grown.
Yeah.
That immediately tells you, okay, there is something illegal, again, to do with supply and demand, called trafficking or human trafficking or forced labor. But given all the good intentions of the different governments around the world and all the big Western companies that have statements on their websites saying they're against modern slavery, it should be over. But actually, it has grown over time. So, are there challenges with trying to stop the flow of illegal drugs? Yeah. Are there challenges to do with forced labor or modern slavery? Yes. So that's only the start of the conversation around challenges.
Yeah.
But as long as the supply and demand are there will be ways to connect them.
Doesn't that pose a risk, for example, to companies who are who sell products that are manufactured in
so that is the risk is a really interesting perspective. Now you would say when somebody is going to buy cocaine, it's a risk to them. Or somebody who is in the middle of the trade and say, I'm the distributor for London for cocaine, it's a risk to me. But there is a reward too. Okay. So I'm willing to take that risk. But maybe different from the drug trade if we think about just vegetables, right? Vegetables and fruits. And I'm talking about in the UK. Yeah. Why is that market associated with modern slavery in the UK? So all domestic, right? The fruit and vegetables grown in the UK, the forced labor also in the UK, brought in, probably trafficked in from Central Europe or Eastern Europe, not very far. So why that challenge is there because the labor is cheap.
Yeah.
And it's been forced to work at £1 a day or whatever. So to try to control it is people will find a solution how to control it. And obviously companies, let's say Tesco's or whatever, when they go to the farmers and they want produce, they want it at the cheapest possible price.
Yes.
So how can you find a cheaper price if you are paying minimum wage? Yeah. The only way to do it would be to bring in illegally modern slaves. So the challenge is in the incentive structures. If large companies want to keep reducing cost, at some point that cost means you have to somehow source labor at lower than minimum wage. I'm not saying the large companies themselves are employing slave labor, but they are contributing to. And a second one, which is a more insidious connection, is that risk management itself creates the risk of modern slavery. It may sound paradoxical, but
yes, it does. Explain that for me.
The solution is, but actually it is quite simple when you think about it. Let's say a company like Amazon or whatever, if you look at the website, a UK website, you'll see a very big anti-modern slavery statement. They are definitely not for modern slavery, but when they buy from companies, they want cheap prices. And then they tell those companies, look, we don't want to be associated with any modern slavery. So that company then, instead of employing slave labor, will employ another company which will employ slave labor. So the slave labor or modern slavery gets deeper and deeper embedded into the supply chain.
Yeah.
And it becomes wider and less visible. So the problem becomes bigger and less visible. But that is okay. Yeah. So trying to reduce being caught in a modern slavery scandal, the companies impose conditions on their suppliers, who in turn might impose conditions on their suppliers, but they want cheaper prices and they want to see that modern slavery is not being used in that company or their suppliers. So basically, those two together push modern slavery much deeper into the supply chain where it's less visible and more prevalent.
Yeah. So it's very important then for companies not just to look at their tier one suppliers, but try to go much deeper in terms of when they're doing an analysis.
Okay, so you tell your tier one suppliers, make sure your suppliers don't have modern slavery. So they then go to the tier two, and then the tier two does the same. But you're just driving the problem further deeper into the supply chain because you still want lower costs.
Yeah.
And you want a statement saying modern slavery is not being used. Yeah. Modern slavery is not being used visibly. That's what it amounts to, because when you push it deeper into the supply chain, it's hidden. So you hide it.
Yes.
So that's why I'm saying, just like with the drug problem, the amount of modern slavery has been steadily increasing. Despite regulations, despite companies signing up to anti-modern slavery charters, despite governments, UK government, California government passing laws, it's counterproductive. So that is the biggest challenge, where the risk management of modern slavery contributes to greater modern slavery in the long term.
Right, because they just keep pushing it deeper and deeper into... And sometimes even offshoring it as well to like countries that...
It will be offshore, yes, of course.
Yeah. So in that instance, I mean, what steps can... So, we see a lot of these companies with these... Every single company nowadays has this modern slavery policy on their website and statements, and they have to put it in their annual reports. But for those companies who really want to make a change and try and eliminate this as much as possible from their supply chain, what are some of the steps that they can do to ensure that their supply chain is free of child labor and human trafficking and forced labor?
I mean, one thing is quite simple. If the cost of an item at a certain labor price is X and you are buying it at X minus delta, something is going wrong somewhere, right?
Yeah.
So one could start from there. And saying, I know a company where they actually made contracts assuming minimum wages, but there it was just a one-tier supplier. So they made sure that the supplier were getting paid enough to cover minimum wage of all the labor.
Right.
And then they could ensure that all the suppliers were getting minimum wage.
Right. Right.
At least. So all the workers in the supplier company were getting minimum wage. But that one was very simple because of the service situation. All the workers were in your facilities. Mm-hmm. You could see what the supplier was paying them or not. But in a multi-tier supply chain, that becomes much harder. But clearly, you can make supply chains shorter. I mean, that's one lesson. If you're buying domestically or you're buying from a supplier, but then that's it. There's not that many tiers of supply chain, but ensuring minimum wage is being paid. Mm-hmm. I mean, companies have started looking at tier 2 suppliers through NGOs or through other means to find out whether all the people employed, whether they are getting minimum wage and they're not paying. In many countries, people were paying to get jobs. So that's effectively a reduction of minimum wage.
Yes.
So those things... I mean, companies are doing these things in a minor way, but I'm just saying that the net effect is still the growth of modern slavery.
What are your thoughts around organizations like Fair Trade and some of these other organizations that helps to validate the supply chain? Yeah. Like when you buy Fair Trade stuff, they tend to be a little bit more expensive than others. And do you think that these supply chains are devoid of these kinds of challenges around child labor and human trafficking? Is there any way we can say a product has absolutely none of these involved?
I think at least going by Fair Trade's reputation and similar organizations, at least they are trying to ensure that for the countries they're buying from, that the farmer is getting some minimal return on their investment when it comes to growing cocoa or rice or whatever. Yeah. So that's definitely a good start. And also there, the supply chain is very short, meaning they're buying from the farmer and that's it.
Right.
Now, if the farmer employs his or her own children, that's part of child labor. It's not a worrisome situation because the farmer would be interested in getting their kids some education if they can. Mm-hmm. So it's not as much of a worrisome situation because the supply chains are short, so Fair Trade can monitor effectively.
Right.
And the calculation, and which is the same calculation I'm suggesting, at least if the cost of growing something and everybody having at least the equivalent of a minimum wage is X, then make sure you're not paying X minus delta, which is in a way what fair trade is doing. But you can't just take the fair trade model to every industry, because the supply chains get much deeper, many tiers, whereas fair trade is just one tier.
Yeah. And I guess, in terms of like doing because one of the things that we do is, we do supply chain audits, especially around the ESG work that we do. And it can be very costly when you start going tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, 4, 5, 6, when you start digging down in the supply chain, it can become very costly and very time consuming as well.
Yeah. So one solution companies have done, if you look at what Apple did, and I think Tesla has copied Apple to some extent. Apple made the list of its top 100 suppliers public. So that gives an incentive for newspapers in the countries where these 100 suppliers are to see if there is lack of sustainability, if there is modern slavery, if there is some other thing. So in a way, you're letting everybody else work on your supply chain for free. Instead of hiring auditing companies, you say, okay, here are all my suppliers, or nearly all my suppliers. If they're doing something bad, well, then at least it's not my problem anymore, because I've told you who my suppliers are. Now those suppliers become more visible because people are saying, okay, let's see what Apple is doing in terms of hanky-panky in their supply chain. So they will investigate those 100 suppliers. And similarly, so in a way, you're letting other people uncover problems in your supply chain. So that reduces Apple's cost.
Does Apple encourage them to report any issues? They encourage that. Oh, that's good, actually.
Yeah, I mean, Apple itself was in this situation with Foxconn because people working too many hours and people committing suicide at Foxconn. So Apple went through that, and so after that they said, okay, here are all our main suppliers, and now if you can find something wrong with any of them, it's their hassle, not ours.
I mean, with the rise in this whole, ESG criteria and topic, globally, and more consumers are becoming conscious of the fact that, the environmental impact and the social impact and all of that. Do you think that this will also help to drive the whole auditing and challenging of companies around their supply chain?
Maybe to some extent, but the purpose of ESG auditing and all that is also there is the marketing aspect of it.
Yes.
There is a defensive aspect of it, meaning you don't want to be seen as the only company in your industry who's not doing it. So in our research, we found that a big part of why companies do ESG transparency and audits and all that is because their peers are doing it. So there's a very strong peer effect. If I'm in an industry where my peers are doing it, then I'll do it too. If I'm in an industry where my peers are not doing it, I won't bother with it either, because as you see, ESG audits, whatever, they are expensive. So I say, okay, why bother if nobody else is doing it in my industry? So there is that peer effect. So you're doing it not because you're trying to do wonders for humanity and sustainability or whatever. You're doing it for competitive reasons or defensive reasons. And you're doing it partly for marketing reasons. Again, that depends on the industry. If you're closer to the end consumer, then you're more likely to be saying nice things and then putting up nice posters of brown-skinned women smiling with their children. And then under that, you write, oh, we do sustainability. And somehow that really cheers up the consumer, at least the Western consumer. And then we can buy that stuff.
So true.
So doesn't mean we have less modern slavery over time. I mean, modern slavery has grown over time, and we need to, maybe the definition has become looser over time or whatever, but it is true that there are far more poor people in the world than there were before. And there is, why are people coming by ferries to England? And many of them losing their lives in the process on boats or whatever. Some of them are coming willingly. Some of them are probably coming unwillingly.
Yes.
But they are coming. If that supply and demand hasn't changed, we want cheaper goods, we want more goods, and we want them cheaply. Somebody will have to pay the price, right? So
true.
It's people we can exploit, then we exploit them.
Sad, but I mean, how can us as consumers, for example, or even investors in companies, I mean, what are some of the things that, especially as consumers, we can do to help to prevent this, if anything? Is there anything we can do, really?
In a world that's sustainable, we shouldn't have this. I mean, this may be a bad analogy, but if we look at nature minus humans, we don't have that much modern slavery and problems with carbon and water. Somehow different species, even though they eat each other and whatever they do, somehow the world gets along pretty well.
Yes, so true.
When you bring humans into the picture, suddenly you have this uncontrollable consumption need.
Yep.
And therefore, to meet that, we have uncontrollable exploitation of resources to provide the supply to meet that demand. And it just feeds on itself. At some point, we say, okay, do I really need to consume that much? And then if that demand goes down, then the supply will go down too. We don't need to invade other countries to get their oil or get some other things. Those things are all part of our consumption. I mean, eventually we need to put the ball back on the demand side, which is in our own courts.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, as consumers, we do what we can in terms of, trying to buy things that are fair trade or,
those things are good, but those things are band-aids, right? Those are not.
I was just about to say that. Yeah.
They work in some situations, in some other industries, the ESG auditing and all that would work. We will keep finding band-aids for different settings, but we need to address the overall problem of demand and supply. If I keep demanding more goods at cheaper prices, you'll have to, as a supplier, somewhere find
it.
Modern slavery to meet that demand.
So I think us as consumers, we need to, if we really want to end this, we need to be prepared to pay a little bit more for some of these goods and services. But on the other hand as well, people are saying, there's a global financial crisis, they're not being paid enough. So everyone is trying to spend as little as they can. And so...
No, that's because we also want more than what we quote unquote need. I mean, we just want to consume more and more. How many pairs of shirts do you need a year? How many pairs of shoes do you need a year? We, as consumers, that's in our control.
Yes.
We can't control what IBM will do or Amazon will do or Tesco's will do, but we can decide how many pairs of shoes do we want. I go to Primark sometimes. I'm just amazed at how big baskets people are filling up with cheap goods. And many of those goods, even when imported from India, are cheaper than what you could buy those goods in India for, and which is shocking that here in central London, you can buy goods, apparel cheaper than you could buy in a developing country like India.
Where they're actually manufactured, most of them.
They might be manufactured there or might be manufactured nearby in Bangladesh or Vietnam, but they're cheaper than what you could buy in the street in poor countries.
Yeah.
And here in central London, supposedly one of the most expensive places in the world, you can buy those goods cheaply. And therefore people are filling up enormous baskets with goods. Why? They're not going to wear all those shoes unless they're importing them back to India to sell in Indian goods in India after making that round trip from London.
Yeah, that's so true. Never thought about that.
So demand is one thing that's up to consumers.
Yes.
Instead of forcing regulations on companies, because the companies can only meet the demand with their supply. And if the supply has to be cheaper and cheaper, well, a lot of things, there'll be exploitation of resources. There will be carbon, there'll be water problems somewhere or the other. There will be modern slavery. Humans are also one other resource, like fossil fuels or fresh water.
So as consumers, we have a responsibility. I completely see that, and I for one has started really examining when I'm buying, especially garments and shoes. Do I really need another pair of shoes? Do I really need another pair of shirts? Those are the things that I'm doing. And I think that collectively, if we all kind of take that position, we will make an impact, no matter how small it is. The other side of it as well, we do a lot of work in the ESG space, is a lot of when we buy a lot of these garments and stuff, we wear them a few times and then we end up throwing them in the dump, and they end up in landfills and not being able to be degraded. But that's another kind of story. In terms of government and regulations, there's a lot of regulations now around ESG, a lot of regulations around supply chain, the S component of the ESG of ESG, which entails supply chain. Do you see that making any impact at all, as far as this issue is concerned?
I'm somewhat familiar with how California passed its modern slavery. And if you read, and it was done when the current Vice President Kamala Harris was, I think she was the Auditor General or something at that time, and she wrote, she authored that Modern Slavery. And you read the language carefully. For me, it seems like, okay, look, the government has done modern slavery. The companies can do whatever they want, because the weak regulations allow governments to say, look, we are the good guys, we passed regulations.
Yeah.
But they allow the companies not to do anything. So passing weak regulations is in a way a win-win between governments and companies, but it's not a win for the poor souls who actually become modern slaves.
Slaves, yes.
So there will always be, governments and companies have to work together to come up with regulations that don't have any teeth. So it allows the government to cover its backside by telling everyone, look, we passed regulation and we're supposed to cheer. The companies and their lobbies are happy because they managed a regulation which actually doesn't really, it may increase their cost of reporting, which they don't like, but then that cost of reporting helps the companies also cover their backside and say, look, we are the white knights or whatever, and there's nothing that could potentially be wrong. Even when things come out, they say, at least we made the good efforts. So, and then the world goes on as it was going on before. So I don't know what purpose, I know the purpose of the regulation and why the companies also obey them, but it's certainly not to reduce modern slavery in reality. The effect is, if you say, oh, we should measure these things only in terms of how effective they've been, same thing with drug trade and police enforcement. Have the amount of drugs reduced? I don't know. I don't think so.
So it's more about trying to resolve the issue at the source then. So because
the source, and the source is in my book is the consumer. I'm pointing the fingers at ourselves as consumers.
Yeah, but then also it's trying to look at, in some of these countries where we're having the issues, and finding out, is it that there are lack of opportunities in these countries?
So that's another thing. Okay, now this is if Western governments, because they've been talking about modern slavery, if they were interested, they could stop messing around with wars or supporting wars on either side in these developing countries.
Mm-hmm.
Right now there's a lot of stuff because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is certainly one feels for the Ukrainian people. But this is hardly anything new. You think about Afghanistan, you think about countries in Africa, you think about these kind of proxy wars going on even
Yes.
today, but more quietly. What will happen to those people who are affected?
Yeah.
They get poorer with fewer economic opportunities.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
then either voluntarily or involuntarily, they board a boat to try to get to England.
Yeah. Yeah. But
So
it's not even only the wars. It's also, the fact that you have large companies that are buying the resources from some of these countries at little or nothing, or just going in and raping it, just like creating the wars, like is happening in the Congo.
It's resources, right? Yeah.
Internally, and then just extracting the stuff. The same thing is happening in Haiti as well, right?
Yeah. It's eventually about whoever wants the resources gets it. I mean, I think it was Gandhi who said that the world has enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed.
Yes.
And therefore, you're going to have these problems. If I go and take away resources from some country, or make sure only a small percentage of people have those there, then we will have modern slavery, because those people have no other resource other than to give their own bodies and their own labor.
Yes. Yeah, that's all they have. That's all they have to sell. So in some instances, and I've always thought about this, in some instances, like, a lot of these talk about ending modern slavery, a lot of these regulations is just pretty much talk and ticking a box.
Because as a consumer, I'd like to feel happy that I'm buying products from a company which somehow doesn't actually guarantee me, but says that they don't do modern slavery.
Yeah.
So I can absolve myself of any guilt buying products from almost any Western company today, because I go to their website, it says we are against modern slavery. I mean, I wouldn't expect them to put up something on their website saying we are for modern slavery to help you bring lower prices. But that's what they're doing.
Yeah. And even some of the regulations, because, we do like governance audits and stuff like that. And, some of the regulators, the question would be, do you have a modern slavery policy? Everyone can have a modern slavery policy. Is what are you doing to ensure that you enforce this?
We put a nice website.
Yeah. A nice policy, well written, some really good words from a marketing expert, and it's stuff like that. Yeah. I mean, it's so responding. So people are talking about responsible business these days, and that's also a huge kind of term. How can company who say that they're a responsible business, like, what are some of the red flags that they need to look out for, to try and see whether or not they're involved or their suppliers are involved in modern slavery?
It's very difficult. You can say you are a responsible business, but it's quite a different thing to say you are a responsible supply chain and speak on behalf of all the entities at tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, whatever the length of the entire supply chain is. So you can be a responsible company in the sense you are not doing anything like modern slavery, but that's very easy for you to do because you don't have that much labor producing goods, because it's all outsourced. And then you say, okay, at least I've taken care of my tier 1 suppliers. I've talked to them. I can vouch for them. You can't vouch for everyone.
Yeah.
You have to also think, do you want to make more profits by making, let's say, expensive goods, but fewer of them? Yeah. Or do you want to go for the mass market where you have lots and lots of very cheap items and yet you are able to make profit on them, but then that profit is coming at somebody's expense?
Yes.
Or the third approach is to say, okay, all this is just marketing, right? So if you as the consumer want me to say I'm responsible business, I'll say that. If you want me to say I'm a green business, I'll happy to say that. Whatever you want, doesn't matter what the reality is, because the reality can always be buried 2, 3, 4 tiers away from, and until you can't really connect me with it. With companies, all we can expect is that they will maximize their profit, and regardless of what they say, because people in companies are incentivized to do that. Companies may say, oh, we are interested in maximizing shareholder price, Actually, not. Managers try to maximize what goes in their pocket and not shareholders' pockets.
Yes. 'Cause the bigger the profit, the bigger their bonus. Yeah. I mean, I call it social washing or swashing.
It could be, yeah. I mean, I'm deliberately being cynical because it's to just say the economics of it should be looked at and not the words. And the economics is there is a large demand for whether it's socially constructed or whether it's based on need. There is a large demand for very cheap products, cheaper than can be produced legally, and therefore somebody pays the price, and that's what we call as modern slavery.
Yeah. I mean, I see it, based on this discussion, you have made it so clear that it's a three-prong approach. The consumer has a responsibility, the companies have a responsibility, and the governments or regulators have a responsibility. And all three has to work in tandem. But I think, that the consumers have the biggest responsibilities because they are the one that drives the demand for these cheaper,
and
cheaper
consumers
goods, right?
can control themselves, and the other two will always benefit by playing games.
Yes. Listen, I mean, we could have this conversation, for such a long time, and but it's been really, really insightful as usual, and I know you have to dash, so unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut the conversation here so you can go. I have so many other questions to ask. But Prof, I'd really like to thank you so much again for coming on board. I remember you were the guest speaker at the launch of my book back in 2016. Yes, at CAS. So yes, thanks again for giving the time up at such short notice to jump on to have this discussion. And
it was my pleasure, Ramya. Yeah, my pleasure, really. And good to see you again.
Yes, definitely. I'll pop by the uni and have a chat with you one of these days when I'm in.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Take care. Thank you for joining us. You can also reach us and find out more about us via our website, lumerous.com.